And we're off. Okay. Hello, Vermont history students, and welcome to Unit 8 of the summer course this 2018. And I guess things are moving along just fine as far as I can tell. Most of you have your first paper in, which means that you have 3 more chances to write 2, and pick 50 years or so a period and pick up sort of at least thematically where you left off before. You don't have to pick up in the exact same year that finished your last paper. The chronology of your paper is really dictated by the material you use. But see if you can't string together 3 papers that sort of collectively tell the history of Vermont as a story that you can understand, so that when you pick up the newspaper today or look at political issues or whatever, the state wakes up around you and you have a historical perspective on how united Vermont is today in its mission to reconcile freedom and unity. So I think the course is running itself well. This morning I got up and I shortened the outline. I got up and had a look at the outline, and it seemed super long. And so actually what I did was, so I shortened the outline, edited it, then I took my kids to tennis, then I sat in Maple Fields and drank coffee, and then I came back, and just now I added a whole bunch of folders of material on a bunch of topics. And so I don't want this video to be like super long, but I did actually add like a whole bunch of material, and I want to explain some of that to you now. The unit picks up where the last one left off, which was the election of 1902. And 1902's election was enormously contentious because it was the people were dealing with the consequences of the explosion of tourism. And one of the things about tourism is that whereas back in 1852, when prohibition on alcohol had been passed, downhillers had wanted that. But when you reach 1902, downhillers now want to reverse prohibition, at least many of them did, so that tourists can drink Chardonnay on hotel porches. Whereas temperance had become basically like the dividing line between respectable and not respectable for uphill people. They had really switched positions. And so that election in 1902 was super contentious with the local option party, and after it was over, the governor, McCulloch, decided what Vermont needed was a referendum on reversing prohibition. And you would have a referendum because then you can bypass the House of Representatives in the legislature, which is dominated by small towns, one town, one vote, which would never have voted to repeal prohibition. And the vote came out that prohibition was repealed, and towns could vote on town meeting day independently of each other whether they wanted to be wet towns or dry towns. And on the I think in Unit 7 in that folder it shows Vermont in black and white. The big towns voted to have alcohol, not just for tourism but also because Catholics lived there, and the small towns still remained dry and everyone hated each other. Downhillers completely misinterpreted the results of this referendum, and in light of how tourism was getting big and Vermont had this cachet, there's this thing about the new Vermont, and Vermont is great and Vermont is new, and this new Vermont phrase became this big movement around 1903, 1904, and 1905. And I'm illustrating that for you with this magazine, which is called Expansion, and there's a folder for Expansion. It only lasted for 3 years, and it had these crazy dual narratives. It wanted expansion, it wanted growth, it wanted prosperity, it wanted development, it wanted industry. But you turn the next page and it would say, Vermont's the ideal summer resort. Vermont's peaceful, it's pastoral, and we need to keep it pastoral, but we can use its pastoral nature in order to make it more industrial, and the more industrial it gets, the more natural it gets, or something. I mean, it's very paradoxical, and I don't know if this is actually like the perfect balance. I have all sorts of documents from that era where people say Vermont is the ideal balance. It's the perfect tradition and progress coexist side by side in perfect harmony. And is that actually what the founders originally had wanted back in 1777? Is that vision actually coming true? And so you can look through the expansion documents. The guy was all over the place. Not enough people apparently subscribed because it went out of business after 3 years. But nevertheless, the New Vermont thing got really super huge. And an example of the New Vermont, I'll tell you briefly this story. I once gave a talk down in Rockingham at this beautiful town house that they have. It's the oldest public building in Vermont, and it's where Bellows Falls is, and it's up on a hill above Bellows Falls, the uphill village. And it went into disrepair in the 1850s and sat there for half a century, falling apart. And then in 1905, 1906, this guy Lyman Hayes decided he would fix up this townhouse because it's such a wonderful piece of history. He was a Brooklyn dude, a businessman who'd retired to Bellows Falls. So he fixed these up there, pounding nails, painting it, and fixing it up. And one problem is tourists kept showing up and looking for their ancestors in the graveyard. But most of the gravestones had fallen over. Many of them had been stacked up in a corner. So Hayes, out of the goodness of his heart to help these people find their ancestors' gravestones, he alphabetized the gravestones. He did. He put them back up in alphabetical order. He didn't move any bodies. He just alphabetized the gravestones. And that's a metaphor to me for what downhillers can do to the state. Are uphillers going to allow downhillers to metaphorically alphabetize their gravestones, to fix things up so they look fake? I mean, they are fake, but they look beautiful, and they're really made out so that tourists can take advantage of them. I mean, this is what we'll do with the fish and game laws. This is what we'll do with the roads. This is what we'll do with the schools. We'll make it so that it's the Vermont that tourists really want. Because after all, do tourists really want uphill life, which is kind of rough, or do they want a magical version of uphill life? That gets you up to that. I have a folder on the Lake Champlain, the Champlain Tercentenary, 300th anniversary of Champlain seeing Lake Champlain, Samuel de Champlain, in 1909, and I just put that up there. I think it's a really important event because it was a big event, a big celebration, but they were celebrating the fact that a Catholic guy, a French Canadian, had come and discovered Lake Champlain, which is kind of weird because Yankee Vermonters had on the whole, hate on French Canadians for a long time. That's why Valentine had brought the Swedes. And so, is the fact that rural life is great, is beautiful, is pastoral, is marketable, going to make downhillers more sympathetic to uphillers, more sympathetic to French Canadians and Irish people? Or are they simply going to paper over the problems? After all, they're talking about Vermont being unspoiled. The Bureau of Publicity published, in 1915, a book called Unspoiled Vermont, and that was their slogan, Vermont's unspoiled. But I have a folder there of pictures of child labor, which I put up just half an hour ago. Clearly Vermont's not unspoiled. It has all the problems that other places have. Dangerous workplaces, child labor, poverty, and all these things. Are downhillers going to fix those things, or are they just going to paper over them and pretend they don't exist, is kind of like the question. The chief vehicle for promoting tourism from the time of Valentine Swede program ending in 1891 to 1908 was the Board of Agriculture, which is weird. And then the Board of Agriculture was abolished in 1908, and there was a vacuum for promoting tourism. So the Secretary of State, Guy Bailey was his name. Bailey Howe Library at UVM is named after him. He stepped in and he founded the Bureau of Publicity. And so I have a bunch of Bureau of Publicity documents up there for you, and you can check those out. And how they advertised and how they had pamphlets like The Lure of Vermont Silent Places, all intended to make people from outside the state think that Vermont was just a rural pastoral ideal in the interest of making Vermont more modern and generating more revenue. So it's always that paradoxical thing that doesn't really make much sense. And just to illustrate these, how like Vermont's not ideal. Have gone and traced the paths, the lives of the people who Valentine brought over from Sweden. I have focused just on the ones who settled in that town called Landgrove, which is down next to Weston and Peru and Dorset, down in the southern part of the state. And in 1914, Charlie Nielsen, one of the Swedes, he had actually come over when he was 2 years old in 1890. He drowned in a big flood right there in Landgrove. And then in 1917, Della Westine, who had a 6-month-old baby, a spark from a stove fell into a kerosene can and it caught the baby on fire, and then she went and tried to put the flames out and caught on fire herself, and both of them died. And that's the thing. Is Vermont going to confront its problems, or is it simply paper over its problems and pretend that everything's beautiful. Is it actually going to fix things? Well, there's two parts to this outline. The first part takes you up to World War I. The second part's the 1920s, and I feel like I've gone on long already. First, the promotion of tourism gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and Vermont really reaches the zenith of its the place it occupies in the American mind as being this pastoral, backward, pure ideal that stands in contrast to dirty, slummy cities. Calvin Coolidge becoming president in 1925 certainly didn't hurt. 1923. Coolidge, you know, had this homespun character as a guy who went out and worked in his work boots. He loved having his picture taken. He loved that image. And I have a folder of Coolidge pornography up there for you. And I have Bureau of Publicity advertisements in the 1920s. And you can check that out. And Wallace and Nothing's Vermont Beautiful. And Vermont was this, tourism got bigger than ever, and Vermont has this place in the American mind. And amidst that all, a professor of zoology at UVM launched the eugenics survey. And I have a folder for eugenics stuff. You should read about it in the textbook, and there's an article in the articles folder by Kevin Dan about the eugenics survey. And what that was about was sterilizing people, was particularly Abenakis, people with Down syndrome, uphillers, taking them and sterilizing them because they were unfit to reproduce. And this was a national movement, you know, and it hit in Vermont. And I don't know how you feel about it. Like, is the bottom line about the eugenics, the 1920s, the eugenics survey? It got so bad that Vermont didn't approximate the ideal, that they had to sterilize people. Or do you think that actually tourism, the selling of uphill life, or at least a version of it, made downhillers more sympathetic to uphillers? And that's the question to which I want you to respond by Friday. And I think that wraps it up, and it better because this got really long. But anyway, hopefully everything's good, and write me, and I'll let this go so it doesn't end abruptly.